Okay, cool. Oh,
Why am
is it
I-
mirrored? Oh, yeah, that works.
Do you want?
No, it's chill. It's chill. I just
Do you want a
project.
mic?
Oh, it's fine. It's fine.
Okay.
Thank you.
Alright. Wait.
Okay, cool. Good.
Thank
Thank you. All right. Thank you for coming to lecture. Sorry for the technical difficulties. Today's programming, though, we'll be talking about the box model, what that is, how we'll apply it in our layouts, and some general spacing terminology. Hopefully by the end of today, we'll have a better sense of how to break down layouts into simpler components and kind of integrate that in our own assignments. Before that, a couple announcements. Homework 1 and 2 are both due now. So if you haven't already, go ahead, turn that in, finish it up. If you've been having any Git issues, make sure your TA knows about it so that we can get it resolved as soon as possible. Yeah, and then also lab 2 will be due next. Connecting to, yeah. Yeah, I'll just turn off Bluetooth actually. Okay, you can use your AirPods. Oh, let me go back. Okay, and homework 3, as always, will be released after our lecture, and it'll be due the following Thursday. So a couple of the topics we'll be going over, we'll just be doing a review of CSS and also some HTML, everything that we've learned so far, and we'll be moving into our newer content with the box model and some layout terms. So first, review. A couple reminders, we should know these now as tags, right? The head tag is a part of the HTML document that has nothing really to do with content. So nothing in the head between the head tags will be displayed on the page. Rather, you can think of this as like where you configure the settings of your page, things like your font styles, things like other assets that you might connect to. This is where you will connect your CSS file to HTML. So things like that. The body, however, is, as you know, the name would suggest, is where all your actual content goes. For CSS, a couple little finicky things. One thing we might forget as we're writing our selectors is color. We'll refer to text color, whereas background color refers to background colors. For changing fonts, there are a few attributes that you might want to mess with. Might want to change the font size or the font style. And so you can either specify that in 2 separate lines, totally fine. You can specify it in 1 as a shorthand, also acceptable. Kind of just a preference thing. CSS is pretty finicky when it comes to the syntax, though, so make sure you always include a semicolon, otherwise your code will not necessarily work. I think there are a few code editors that are kind of forgiving, but not all of them are like that. So remember your semicolons. And then here's just a quick example of what we should know now as a pseudo selector. If we want to grab the A tag, right, and we want something to happen when we hover it, maybe we want to change its text color to blue, this is how we might achieve that. And so I've included here a CSS selector cheat sheet because there are a lot of rules, and it is like a lot to remember. And even now, I don't have them all memorized. And so this link, the reference sheet, is linked to what you see here, which I think is maybe 3 or 4 pages, and you can just download it and just have it up on your side whenever you're writing code, so that if you're like, hey, I want to do this, but I don't want to like necessarily look it up. Pretty much everything is contained within these 3 pages for everything you'll have to ever use in regards to CSS. So I'd highly recommend taking a look at it. Don't try like learning from it because it's not going to make sense to you. These are very like summarized, bulleted like descriptions of them. So make sure you integrate them in your assignments first, and then use this as like a reference for later. Okay. And so now we have this example. If you were to click on that link, it'll take you to a more like interactive page. But if we just look on the left, we have our HTML file. We have some nested divs here, or sorry, nested elements. And on the right is our CSS file. And so take a look at it for a quick second. And I want you to try to, on your own, figure out what each selector is going to specifically target based on the rules that we've established. And just as a reminder, Commas mean that we're selecting everything included here, right? So not just the H1s, but also the LIs, okay? When we separate something with a space, which is super similar to this, just without the comma, instead what we're saying is, okay, grab the element with the food list tag, and then within that, all those child elements, any child elements that are of type LI, apply this rule. So that's kind of the summary here. As a reminder, the dot refers to a class. The hashtag or the pound sign refers to an ID. I think I said tag, but this is an ID. And then nothing is just the tag. Okay. So give that a sec, try to figure it out. If you guys need clarification about what I mean, here's the first one, right? So in this case, H1 and LI, this would apply the Arial font to everything highlighted on the left. Okay, so try figuring out what that would look like for the second one. And if you're done with that, try moving on to the third one. I'll give you guys maybe like a minute just to try to figure out what that might be. Okay, so hopefully now we have some ideas of what it might look like. Now let's just check it against the solutions here. So food list LI. So all LIs that are children of the food list, or sorry, of the element with the food list ID. So we know we should probably be looking here. Let's see. Boom. So that's kind of the one-to-one relationship here. With a thumbs up, did we, with a show of thumbs, did we get something like that or like similar? Just to gauge where we're at. Okay, that's good, that's good. Same thing here. This one's a little more specific, right? So this one, the way we can interpret this is, okay, all elements of UL tag, right? So first identify that. And then we know we have a space. So we're looking now at the children, which are just all the elements nested directly within that. All those children with the class of highlights, which we have here. And then the cafe list, that's just the same as food list, except we're looking at the second list. So I don't think we included that. Yeah. Before I move on, any questions? What questions do we have so far? Okay. So now we'll move into some new content, what we're going to refer to as the box model. So for the next few slides, we're going to be using this picture frame analogy. And we'll kind of see how this translates to HTML and CSS. But for now, I think the major things to identify are the actual picture, which is contained in that box right here. Each of these pictures, and then also the frame, right? And then there are a few other things we might notice, such as, well, the picture isn't exactly like flush with the frame. There's some spacing in between. That might be something to note. The frame itself also is not one-dimensional, right? It has some width to it. And also the frames aren't sticking next to each other. There's some spacing there. So we want to think of this in terms of the actual dimensions of each item, of each picture and frame, as well as the spacing within and around, right? So following with this analogy, so I'm covering some of this. Bring it down. So in terms of technical terminology, what we would refer to as the picture is the content, right? And so if we were to have some div with some like text inside, or maybe a div within that, that's what we'd be referring to, okay? The actual content contained in some container, right? Notice now there's the space between the content and its container. We're going to refer to that as the padding. There's a lot of terms to hold on to, but we'll see a slide with everything. But just know that the distance between the content and its container is the padding. Or sorry, the space, which we'll see can vary. Now, as I alluded to earlier, the frame itself also has its own dimensions. It has a border width, and we will refer to that as the border. The border itself has a lot of properties in its, in and of itself. It's not just the width. And we'll kind of see that later. And lastly, the margin. So really a more accurate depiction would be not just the margin in between these two, but also around it as well. Okay, and so this might seem a little confusing because there's a lot of colors, a lot of lines going on, but we've color coded the border, padding, content, all of those within this picture, and of course the margin. So now kind of jumping out of this analogy and into a more abstracted version, we can take away this, and then what we're left with is just this concept, this abstracted diagram. This is essentially how HTML and CSS will view these properties. Altogether, we have constructed our box model, right? And so we have all these terms listed on the left, and again, corresponding to the diagram on the right. And what we'll notice is we have some dashed lines here and some solid lines. The solid lines will refer to the dimensions of like tangible containers or elements, whereas the dashed lines are more so to indicate things like properties of them and spacing. So for example, notice this solid line surrounds our border. That'll be the actual width of whatever container contains our content. And then of course, this solid line here surrounds only our content, has nothing to do with spacing. That again would be dimensions associated specifically with content. Okay, we're not going to do this. I actually do encourage you guys, if you want practice in a very isolated setting, this link will take you to an interactive IDE where there is some template code with the border, padding, margin, all of that set up for you. And you can change those pixel values to see what will change when I change this value. You know, how will the spacing be affected when I change the padding, etc. Okay. So again, kind of reviewing this, how does this kind of tie into our design principles? Well, when we write something up like this is valid. You know, you can probably read it and understand it. Fine. Welcome to What Did a Homework 3 is released tonight, right? But of course, there are some design issues as indicated here. There's no spacing, no visual hierarchy. You don't really know what to look at. Again, low contrast, so it might not be the easiest to read. So how do we keep the same HTML and make it improve its design? Well, let's introduce some concepts from the box model. Oh, I didn't realize you can't really see that. Okay, maybe you can. So maybe take a minute to try to identify where the content is. Give you a hint, it's the text. Okay, and where the box is that surrounds it, the padding, the border, maybe the border width, right? And then the margin between those elements. So again, as indicated here, these are two separate containers, two separate boxes, right? So where might the margin be? Where might the borders be? Give you a second to just kind of think of that on your own. Okay, and let's see. Were you correct? Boom. That's the content. That's it right there. The padding. I'm sure you guys can like figure it out from here outward, but let's go one at a time. Boom, padding. Think of the picture frame. Border. If we'll see here, width, padding, margin, these all have single pixel values, right? Which is just saying this is the width that I want around it, all around. Border, on the other hand, has a pixel value, it has some descriptor, and it has a color. The only two that are necessary for border to work is a pixel value to indicate the width and also the style, which in this case is solid. As we saw earlier, we could also have like dotted or dashed. There's a lot of styles you can use, but those two are the bare minimum to have a border that shows up. Sky blue is optional, just indicates a color. And of course, we have our margin. Dope. What else? Oh, and so what we've seen so far is, again, like I just said, all those spacing values where everything is equal. That doesn't have to be the case because you can split them into the top, right, bottom, and left. If, for example, you want something offset, not necessarily centered, you can manipulate certain values to push it more to one corner or whatever you think will suit your needs, as indicated here. And so this is just one example where we might be doing that. You can separate them into multiple lines. This is probably easier to read. It just takes up more, height in your code. If you do want to pack it into a single line, you can write it like this, but you do have to remember that it does correspond to top, right, bottom, and left, kind of in that what's that, clockwise orientation. So that's one way you can pack it in together. You'll see a lot where CSS can either be written like in multiple lines or a single line. It all just has to do with readability. Same thing with margins. Okay, so going back to this, actually, shouldn't have skipped this. When we want to specify values for our margins or our padding, so far we've seen only pixels, right? And so pixels are just those like tiny, tiny dots that I don't even think is visible to the naked eye, but all the squares that make up your screen, right? I didn't know this, but 100 pixels, approximately an inch, cool. The only problem with pixels is that they're a static value. So 100 pixels is 100 pixels like everywhere, right? But this isn't responsive to different screen sizes. So we might see in future lectures why that might be an issue. One that we do recommend using for what we'll refer to as responsive layouts, ones that will adapt to changing screen widths or heights, is percents. And so if you know the dimensions of your parent container, you can use a percent to refer to that and respond correspondingly. So for example, in this case, we have an outer div and an inner div. If the outer div is just contained in the body, if our web page is, let's say our browser width is 400 pixels, then our outer div will be 200 pixels. And then because the inner div is nested within the outer div, saying width of 50% doesn't also give it 200 pixels. It kind of like stacks or it multiplies, right? We only look relative to its parent. And so the inner one would be 100 pixels. That's kind of how we get those values. Okay. And then similar concept for typography. You can specify points like, if you guys remember MLA format, 12-point font, right? That's a static value. And we're all using the same sheets of paper, so it's chill to use that. You're not going to like change the size of your paper. But again, falls into the same issue. Web browsers are not static pieces of paper. You might want to use percents. Cool. Okay. Before I move on, what questions do we have about what we've seen so far? Okay, we'll move on to layouts. And so here's just an example of a design employing some of our visual hierarchy principles, right? We have our header, we have some text. Notice the header is a little bolded, it has a little highlight, the text is smaller, less bold. Okay, just note all those things. And yeah, so pretty much the thought process behind how we structure this is pretty simple. It's what do we want our audience to look at first? How do we emphasize certain points? How do we direct their attention with just how we visualize something, how we lay it out? And so that's kind of like the driving thought process behind this. And here's the code that would follow. We've seen again, I did indicate that you can use percents, you can use pixels, all that. There are also some native things to CSS, such as auto, in which case it'll kind of do something for you, which the behavior might not be like super well defined or like clear to a new user. But yeah, those are just some tools you can use. There's also this problem of maybe we want our layout to be different. Maybe we don't want things stacked, or sorry, maybe we don't want them stacked vertically. Maybe we want them side by side. I'm just throwing out a lot of questions that we might see solutions to in the future. And so we have one of these solutions here, which is our display property. So display is just like color, it's just like background. It's just a property that would be specified within a CSS selector. And over here, as these icons kind of indicate, there are different values for this. Inline block is kind of like a good medium between block and inline. The descriptions are here. Inline block is kind of like, trying to think of an analogy for this. but it suits most purposes. But if, for example, you want something more specific, you can use one of these as well. So if we were to combine display with one more thing, maybe we want things to stick to one side over the other. Maybe we want to left justify our elements or right justify. We can combine our display inline block with the float property, which kind of is specifying that like left, right, or center alignment. Okay. Moving on to layouts. This is less of a technical thing and more of like a, yeah, it's pretty non-technical. Let's see how we can break it up. Okay. So I know this UI is like really old. I'm sure Facebook looks very different now, not that I really use it, but there's a lot of things going on here, right? We can identify there is this big, I think Berkeley squirrel. There's this header section. There's text here. There's things that are jumbled together, almost like a puzzle. And if we were to think about, if I told you right now, like code this up with your HTML and CSS experience, it's probably a huge task, right? And you probably wouldn't know how to approach it. So what I'm going to offer to you is this way of thinking where we build these blocks up together from the smallest components by kind of reverse engineering it. So let's try to break things into blocks. Not more than 2 though, okay? I'm going to say we can either divide it vertically or we can divide it horizontally. And you just have to choose one, right? So let's try. For example, here's 2 blocks, pretty simple. I think if I told you, take the main content container and then make it separate from the header, I'm sure we could do that, right? Because it's just 2 divs stacked on each other. Cool. Let's go a little deeper though. What about within that main container? Okay. Do we see a division that we can use to further split this up? Anyone have a suggestion of how we might, what the next half cut might be? Doesn't have to be like exactly in half, but just one direction. Any suggestions? What might we do? Probably don't want to do this, right? Because that takes 2 cuts. What could we do instead? Go shout it out. I see. Oh, never mind. I thought you were like, any thoughts? What could we do? Yes. Yeah, maybe the left side, right? Because simply it's just one cut down this line. And now we've separated it into our left column, whatever that might be, which is just, I don't know, kind of like a menu bar. And then the right column is everything else. So I'm going to say this term a lot where you isolate one thing and then there's everything else. That everything else might still have components left to, divvy up, but that's fine. You can figure it out later because of how HTML allows for nested divs. You can nest a div like infinitely. And so it's totally fine for what we're doing here, right? Because everything else is its own div, which probably has like 7 or 5 or 6 more nested divs within them. And so I'm just going to keep going. Maybe we'd cut the picture from the rest of everything else. Boom. So those are maybe 2 rows that are stacked vertically. And again, at this point, probably, cut down here. And so notice what we've done is we took this really complicated layout and just by a series of cuts and nested cuts, we have appropriately assigned each element as a div with a very simple your left or right or your top or bottom, right? Relative to your parent. And so that kind of, I guess, process is how you can reverse engineer a layout and also create your own layouts. So really important tool. Let's keep going. This one I'm not actually going to demonstrate, but can I just get a show of hands? Has anyone like double clicked or like right clicked and used inspect element to like change the text on your page before? Okay, yeah, a few of us. Yeah, so inspect element is a tool that exists not just within Chrome, but I feel like Chrome is the most popular one. It allows you, yes, to change the text and like pretend to be a hacker. But really the more important tool, at least in the scope of this class, is that it will allow you to see the dimensions of your divs. It'll allow you to pretty much debug your front end because there really is no concept of debugging front end, I guess, up until this point. And yeah, so if you're ever trying to write something up, you're like, why is my div not centered? Why is this text not showing up? Where is my div? Why is this 2 times as like tall as it should be? Inspect element is your best, is like your magnifying glass to like figure out what's going wrong. So it's as simple as doing, again, if you're on a laptop, 2 fingers, just like you would normally, and then find inspect element. So if you want to give it a shot now, if you're, taking notes for a different class, try double tapping and then see if you can like change the text or something. Pretty much what it does is it opens up the HTML document that's being displayed, and you can manipulate it real time. Those changes don't last. So if you refresh it, those changes disappear. But go ahead, give that a try if you're, trying something else right now. And yeah, so this is what it'll look like. So a couple features that I did mention, if you hover over an HTML tag, it'll highlight the corresponding tag that's being the corresponding element that's being displayed. If you click on it, you can also see what CSS is being attached to it, right? So maybe you use your CSS rules a little incorrectly, so this might be a way to check it. And then, of course, these other ones that are less common. Let's see. These are all pretty much things that I've already talked about. But yeah, just to reiterate, you do want to break down your complicated layouts as small relationships as either rows or columns. And that'll give you a better idea of how to write that in code. Just because there is a pretty wide gap between the visual that you envision and the HTML code. So this process of breaking it down into simpler steps will kind of narrow that gap. Okay, I believe this is the last, yeah, that's the last slide. So that's it for the programming lecture. I will open it up to any questions, anything that we saw today or up until today. Any questions before we move on? Anything that might have stood out to you as I didn't expect that. Why is that? Okay. If no other questions, I will pass it off to who's doing Kylie? Pass it off to Kylie. Yeah, this is Kylie. I can just you wanna oh, okay, go for it.
Thank you. Hello? Oh, there we go. Okay, I'm gonna be using this thing because I don't want to yell. Welcome to the design portion of our web design lecture. Today, we're gonna be talking about typography and web design. Typography is basically the style and appearance of text, and text is one of the primary ways designers can communicate with users. Before we begin, this is really fun. This is a CFS cheat sheet for all the stuff that we learned. Super, super, super useful. It'll be up on the ed. I highly encourage you guys to have it open, maybe print it out when you're doing your homework or labs or anything like that. Just one of the really great resources we have for you guys. All right. So why is typography important? Well, as you can see, it's very hard to read these 4 things here. The first one, because light colors are really hard to read on light backgrounds. Sometimes fancy fonts can get a little funky. And when the font's too small, obviously a lot of us can't read it. A cool quote by Matthew Tater is, "Type is a beautiful group of letters, not a group of beautiful letters." So typography evokes the personality and character of a website. And as you can see here, these are some examples of how like clever and clean font choices help make a brand a little bit more interesting. So, yeah. More than 80% of the information is expressed in pure text. And this kind of shows why type choices are so important. And it really helps us emphasize and group content the way that we want to. Yeah, so basically the main points are we want to communicate effectively using typography and focusing on size, weight, and color. How do we make typography work? There are two basic types. There are serif fonts, and those are the ones with the small flicks on the end of the letters. That's on the left side here. Sans means without, so sans serif means without the flick, and those are the ones that are kind of plain, a little more modern. But yeah, serif fonts are usually easier to read in like printed works than sans serif fonts, and this is why you'll kind of see them in like articles, maybe newspapers and things like that. And this is because serif makes the individual letters more distinctive and easier for our brains to recognize quickly. Without the serif, our brain has to spend longer identifying the letters because the shape is less distinct. The commonly used convention for printed work is to use the serif font because, like we said, it's a little bit easier to read, whereas sans serif is often used for headings, tables, text, and captions, and things like that. So here are some examples of how you've probably seen it in popular media. As you can see on the left, for Vogue, serif is a little bit more classy, kind of reserved, a little bit sassy. It's got the little flick at the end. And then sans serif is a little bit more modern, technical, pretty bold. And yeah. A little more on that, serif is super good for text-heavy content. So as you can see here, all the paragraphs are in serif, whereas the headers are in sans serif, and those are good for image-heavy content. So now we're going to talk about groups of fonts. So a typeface is like when one font has different weights to it. So this is like all the same font, but the one on the top is bolded and the one on the bottom is light. So you can see how it differs and how we can use spacing to kind of emphasize certain things and group them in a clever way. But yeah, we're basically using it to create like a hierarchy. So think about it as blocks. And then this is just like an overview. This is what a typeface is. So it's all the same font, but different types. So all the way from light to bold. The general rule of thumb for a website is you usually want to keep it to about 2 or 3 fonts. Anything more than that gets kind of overwhelming. It might get a little bit cluttered. So I encourage you to pick 2 or 3 that really stand out to you, ones you think work well together, and kind of keep consistent with that all throughout the website. But obviously, type is not an exact science. It's aligned when it feels aligned. So if something feels right to you, if maybe you go over the 3 font limit for one of your websites, that's totally fine. Whatever you think looks best, go with that. Okay, so grids are a great way to help us kind of group and align our typography within our website. It can be useful to help us divide our content in a cohesive, aesthetic way. And I think Figma has grids, most design apps have grids that you can utilize to kind of set your stuff up in a nice way. But sometimes you just have to eyeball it. Go with what feels right to you. Play around with it, see what looks best. Okay, next we want to use line spacing between 1.2 and 1.5 to keep things kind of readable. Otherwise it gets super cluttered, stuff is like stacked on top of each other, might be really hard to read. So this is a good general rule of thumb to keep stuff like super readable. And then building on that, we want to keep stuff kind of narrow. It's like super tedious to read stuff that's like spanning all the way from the left side of the screen to the right side of the screen. It causes a lot of back and forth action, and that's not fun. It's always easier for users to read more narrow, condensed text, because then we don't have to move our head around as much. All we have to do is skim it. So yeah, as you can see, the one on the right is probably easier and more convenient to read than the one on the left over here. Okay, so here's an example of the contrast between thin and thick fonts. Thin fonts work better on darker backgrounds generally. So as you can see, the thin font on the green background looks really nice, but the thick font on the green background doesn't look so awesome. It's kind of like chunky. It just doesn't look too great. But the bold one on the white background does look a lot better, and it stands out to us more than the light one on the light background. Let's guess. Okay, so in short, here's an overview of all the things that we covered. Don't freak out over typefaces, just kind of pick one. Think about it as blocks, like we talked about. Align with your eyes. You can use grids, but kind of just go with your gut. That comes with practice. You'll figure it out with time. Hierarchy first, use contrast, fine tune with spacing, and there you go. That's pretty much the formula for making things look pretty with type. Okay, now we're going to talk about how to choose a font. There's a super cool tool that some of you have probably heard about. It's called Google Fonts. And it basically has like every font you could ever think of here in this website. And it shows you like all the different weights that it has, weights that come with it. And it even lets you like test out what your text would look like with that font. So you can just type something in and it'll show you like, oh, this is what it would look like on your website. So yeah, I highly recommend using this tool when you're doing your project, because it's like super fun to play around with and see all the different options that you have. Another like place for inspiration or like to explore different fonts is this website called typesample.com. There's so many different types of fonts, and it's just really fun to play around and see what you can find. And then Typewolf is also another really cool place for inspiration. It shows a lot of combinations and just like trends in typography. If you're ever like stumped and you don't really know what to do, I definitely recommend checking this out because it's full of really good ideas and cool combinations. And then what font is actually an extension? You can add it to Chrome, and then whenever you hover over a piece of text, it'll tell you where it's from. So if you've ever looked at a website and you're like, wow, this text is really cool, I wonder what font it is. This is a really great extension, and it'll like show you what's going on. Okay, so there are so many exceptions and so many styles to communicate through type. So obviously you don't have to follow all the rules. It's kind of like an artistic thing. Get creative with it. Do what seems cool to you, whatever you want to, wherever it takes you. But yeah, get inspired, look at some of these examples, maybe check out other websites. And yeah, I'm excited to see what you guys pick. Okay. Another cool feature of Google Fonts is that it doesn't just come in English, it comes in many different languages. So if you ever wanted to make a website or look for fonts in another language, you're in luck because it does that as well. Okay, and then lastly, here's an example of a really cool Instagram page that shows us how type in conjunction with color theory can make really cool images or even art. Like this looks like a cool poster to me. But yeah, we're gonna talk more about color theory next week. So yeah, stay tuned, get excited. And that is pretty much it. Does anyone have any questions before we release you? No, okay, then I will give you the attendance form for today's lecture. The secret word can be, what? That's such a long word. What if people don't know how to spell that? The word can be type. Okay. I'm very creative today.
Yay. How do I stop the recording? Pause recording. Stop.